Welcome to Military Analytics. What is democracy? Philosophers and political scientists have debated this question for many years. There are dozens of different answers to the definition of democracy. But at its most basic level, democracy means that people can freely express their demands. This is possible in democratic countries, but oppressive leaders do not want democratic demands to be discussed. Russian President Vladimir Putin is increasing his repression against the people every day. He is trying to prevent the democratic demands of the Russian people. However, the Russian people continue to revolt against Putin's policies. Russian people are using interesting methods to protest Putin as anchor. In fact, it was not possible for the Russian people to organize very big protests because such protests were never allowed in Russia. Putin, who has ruled Russia since 1999, intervened in all protests. But in recent years, Putin's pressure has increased more. After Russia decided to invade Ukraine, the Russian people were very brave and started protests. These first protests were stopped very harshly by the police. Protesters were arrested and police presence was increased all over the country. But the Russian people constantly found new ways to continue their protests. Russian protesters are communicating through social media. Russian youth organized through social media platforms are doing their best to stop this war. Russian youth think that Putin should resign as soon as possible. These protests by Russian youth are attracting a lot of attention from the public, especially the families of the soldiers support these protests. Hundreds of thousands of people in Russia have been forcibly recruited into the army and sent to war zones. Soldiers cannot communicate with their families. Families are very worried because they have no news from their soldiers. It is common knowledge that the Kremlin government has not accurately disclosed the number of Russian soldiers killed. It has been repeatedly revealed that the Kremlin has released false information. That's why the families of Russian soldiers are demanding an explanation as soon as possible. The families always support the young protesters. It is also known that the Russian people are in a very difficult situation because of this war. Every day the Russian people are shaken by the news of the death of soldiers. Many soldiers from every region of Russia have died. Russian people want this war to end. This war has also made the living conditions in Russia very difficult. First of all, Russian citizens are in great fear. Russians, especially those living close to Russian military bases, are experiencing great panic. Russia cannot ensure the security of its country. There is also a huge economic crisis in Russia because of the war. The Russian stock market is rapidly losing value. The people in Russia are experiencing a huge crisis due to the rapid increase in inflation. The Russian people want this war to end and Putin to resign in order to solve the economic crisis. The methods used by the Russian people to voice their demands on this issue are also quite interesting. Russian citizens are trying new methods against Putin's repression since the police intervened too harshly in anti-war protests in Russia. Rebels are trying a new method. Russian citizens start riots due to local problems in their regions. For example, in Russia, a group of young people gathered to protest against a municipal park project. This prevents the police from banning the protest. The activists then start chanting anti-war slogans. As a result, protests are organized one after the other in many cities across Russia. These actions are having a significant impact in Russia. More and more people in Russia are uniting against Putin. One of the slogans of the protests has influenced millions of people in Russia. Courage is contagious. Protesters have started writing this phrase on walls in different Russian cities. Russian people's anger against Putin continues to grow. This is also affecting Russian politics. According to polls conducted in Russia, the rate of Putin's supporters has dropped to 35%. Putin is nearing the end of his political career. It is thought that Putin cannot win any election in Russia anymore. Therefore, Russian politics is experiencing very active days. However, according to experts, the person expected to lead the country after Putin is not a politician for many years. Putin has intensely repressed opposition politicians. One of the opposition politicians, Alexei Navalny, was poisoned. There was no strong actor against Putin in Russian politics. However, the harshest criticism of Putin in Russia recently comes from a businessman, Yevgeny Prigozhin. The leader of the Wagner Group, a mercenary company operating in Russia, has increased his criticism of Putin. Prigozhin had very strong relations with Putin in the past. However, they have recently fallen out. Prigozhin is making very harsh statements against Putin. The defeat of the Russian army in Ukraine is increasing Prigozhin's power because the Wagner Group is now very important for Russia. Russia cannot win this war without the Wagner Group. That's why Putin cannot do anything against Prigozhin. Prigozhin, on the other hand, continues to increase his criticism of Putin. Prigozhin is one of the most famous people in Russia. He also has an influential power over the Russian military and bureaucracy. He aims to use this power to become the new leader of the Kremlin palace. Prigozhin's aim is causing tensions to Russia to rise. Prigozhin is trying to prove the power and importance of the Wagner Group, saying that the Russian army did not carry enough weapons for the soldiers. Prigozhin said that he would withdraw from Bakhmut on May 10th. After this statement, the Russian authorities experienced a great panic. The Russian army needs the support of the Wagner Group. According to some allegations in the Russian press, Prigozhin has other plans. Prigozhin is allegedly planning to secretly support anti-Putin protests in Russia. Thus, it is planned to increase the anger against Putin even more. On the other hand, another interesting claim about the protest was shared in the Russian press. The Kremlin was worried that the anti-Putin protests in Russia were on the agenda all over the world. The Kremlin administration claimed that the Russian people were supporting Putin's policies. That's why the Kremlin leaders made a special plan. A group of Russian citizens gathered in Moscow to protest against Sweden's decision to join NATO. This protest was shared by the Russian press, which is controlled by Putin. Russian police did not intervene with these protesters. Kremlin leaders made efforts to ensure that this protest was covered in the European press. According to allegations in the Russian press, some of the participants were public officials in Russia. It was claimed that Russian intelligence secretly organized this event. Anti-Putin youth in Russia think that this protest is a completely fake organization. While the tension between Ukraine and Russia continues to increase, the violent clashes between the armies of the two countries mostly affect the civilian population. After the attacks on the Kerch Strait bridge connecting Crimea and Russia last fall, Russia began attacking Ukraine's infrastructure facilities and civilian settlements. Although these attacks were caught in the steel curtain of the Ukrainian air defense units, the few Russian missiles and kamikaze UAVs hit and inflicted great damage on the Ukrainian people. As a result of the offensive operations launched by Ukraine since the end of summer, Russia is losing an average of 300 to 800 soldiers a day, and the majority of these soldiers are untrained soldiers mobilized in the autumn. The families of the dead soldiers were both devastated because their sons died, and miserable because almost the whole world was imposing economic sanctions against Russia. The fact that the war affected the civilians the most naturally created anger among the people. And from this anger, the Ukrainian partisans were born. Ukrainian partisans fought in the shadows from the very beginning of the war. Partisans sabotaged the Russian army in many places, worked in coordination with the Ukrainian army on many fronts, and provided intelligence to the army and destroyed targets that the army could not reach. In the name of Ukraine's freedom, most recently, Ukrainian partisans blew up the car of the so-called vice president of Novaya Kakhovka. But we will share details about this with you in the coming minutes. The Russian army and authorities were the target of brutal attacks by resistance fighters throughout the war. The tactics used range from car bombings to poisoning and shooting. Russian army officials desperately tried to stop the tide of partisan attacks and to increase security in the areas they controlled. There were allegations that Russian army officials even offered rewards to those who denounced people expressing pro-Ukrainian views. Despite increasing security, Ukraine's brave resistance still manages to deal major blows to Russian elements behind Russian lines. Partisans blew up the car of Vitaly Gora, the so-called Kremlin-appointed deputy head of the administration of the Russian-controlled Novaya Kakhovka in the Kherson region. The explosion occurred at noon in Pobeda Avenue, near the Tasty Country Cafe in Novaya Kakhovka. Ukrainian partisans claimed responsibility for the bombing. It was also reported that civilians were not injured as a result of the explosions, while the vice president was injured and is currently in the hospital. In August 2022, it was said that Vitaly Gora was allegedly shot dead. But a month later it was learned that this was a staging by the FSB of the Russian Federation against the possible actions of real Ukrainian saboteurs. Later, a statement appeared that the Russian FSB could not stage the murder of Vitaly Gora, deputy head of Novaya Kakhovka, because it was stated that the Russian special services did not have time for this. Despite all this, Although the Ukrainian partisans narrowly missed their targets, the regional officials appointed by Russia, despite all the security measures, proved once again that they were not safe inside Ukraine. So what was the contribution of partisan actions to the war? Ukrainian partisans have carried out dozens of confirmed attacks in Ukraine, killing at least 11 Russian officials and known collaborators. The local population is an important source of information about the number and movement of Russian troops since the beginning of the large-scale war. Ukrainian intelligence has received a shower of data from the local population with whom we cooperate, are surprised at such a unique situation where local people provided detailed information. The partisan action and cooperation of the local people gives the Ukrainian armed forces a unique advantage over the Russians. The Russians have spent significant resources defending the captured territories, but the traitors and Russian collaborators are eliminated in successive assassination attempts by local resistance forces. For this reason, the Russians do not feel comfortable in the territory under their control. Partisan groups actively opposed to the Russians now operate in Russian-controlled territory, especially in the south. Among them are those with military training and ordinary citizens who work hand in hand. Collectively, they help the Ukrainian army by providing reliable and timely information on military depots and concentrations of Russian troops. The partisans themselves are focused on sabotaging and removing collaborators. The scale of the Ukrainian resistance movement has reached such a level that the Russians are now having serious problems trying to maintain control. As a result of effective attacks by Ukrainian partisans, the Kremlin had to spend resources on security at the rear rather than on operations at the front. This reduces Russia's ability to defend itself against ongoing Ukrainian counterattacks. Far from funding Russia's own offensive operations, in other words, the actions of the Ukrainian partisans have helped the Ukrainian army to gain the upper hand against the Russian army. So what exactly are the tasks of the Ukrainian partisans? Partisans have two main tasks: monitoring and collecting reliable data on the direction of the Russian army, including the location of its warehouses and barracks, and the destruction of collaborators. An interactive map and detailed analysis of reliably verified attacks by Ukrainian partisans since the beginning of the war has been published. The coordination of local partisans helped in the efforts of Ukrainian Special Operations Forces to destroy the Russian army and its collaborators in Russian army-controlled territory. Thanks to the efficiency of the partisans' work, the Ukrainian army was able to deliver decisive blows to the concentration and equipment of the Russians in the Sumy and Kiev regions. Last April, Ukrainian intelligence reported details of a partisan named Kurt, a local hunter who raided the forest and rediscovered Russian positions. Thanks to Kurt, they managed to destroy 12 Russians with armored vehicles. In midsummer, partisans working with the Ukrainian army destroyed a warehouse containing Russian weapons and ammunition on Novokakhovka. Dozens of other explosions have since been recorded in the last 2 months, killing or injuring local collaborators in areas occupied since then. Melitopol is considered the unofficial center of the Ukrainian partisan movement. Indeed, the Melitopol area is marked on the maps as a region where the Russian troops do not have full control over the area due to active partisan movement. Another notable act of the resistance movement in Melitopol was the blowing up of a railway bridge near the village of Yakimivka. Last spring, Russian forces had until then used the bridge to deliver military equipment and ammunition from the Crimean Peninsula to mainland Ukraine. According to the Ukrainian General Staff following the attack, the destruction of the bridge was the result of the work of Ukrainian special forces and organized partisan groups. The destruction of the logistics infrastructure in Melitopol is a common occurrence. The partisans blew up an armored train carrying Russian troops and has already carried out numerous sabotage attacks on the railway. Since last May, the partisan movement has concentrated elsewhere, including the Zaporizhia region. In addition, the partisan movement began to work in the Crimea, which the Russians had turned into a military base to attack the Ukrainian mainland. At the beginning of summer, the Russian army regularly tried to intimidate the partisans with threats of the death penalty, but this was not enough to stop them. Ukrainian partisans continued to resist. Partisans in the Kherson region are actively conducting information attacks on the Russians and those who agree to cooperate with them. They also distribute leaflets with promises of rewards for the heads of main collaborators. These include a prize of about $10,000 to Kirill Stremusov, deputy head of the Kherson District Administration, and a similar award for Russian collaborator Melito Palmyr Yevhen Biletsky. Even in the Luhansk region, where pro-Russian support has historically been the greatest, partisans are starting to make an impact. The partisans have started working in the region and are quite successful, not only hanging leaflets but also demolishing infrastructure facilities. This helps to slow down the attacks and advance of the Russian army. In September, the distribution network for the railway lines of the Luhansk region was destroyed. This stopped the rail logistics networks of the Russian army for a while. In August, in Belavodsk, Luhansk, partisans opened fire on a car carrying the mayor and his deputy. Although the Ukrainian partisan movement started with the war with Russia, it has a historical depth. We see that the Ukrainian partisan movement intensified during the periods when Napoleon and Hitler entered Ukraine and the armies of the attacking states had a very difficult time. Unless Russia stops its attacks against Ukraine, the partisan movement looks like it will hurt Russia even more. The Ukrainian armed forces began to take critical steps to end the war with Russia. Assistance from Ukraine's allies has provided a ray of hope for the besieged nation. Most recently, the United Kingdom announced that it had trained 20,000 Ukrainian soldiers for a spring offensive against Russia. A record number, 60,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been trained in the UK by British forces since last summer. The initial goal of the 60,000 Ukrainian soldiers is thought to be liberation of the Crimean Peninsula. Let's explore the most remarkable details of the strategic training received by those Ukrainian soldiers. Details about this training will actually show us very important clues about the siege of Crimea and the mysterious plans of the Ukrainians. First of all, in the military training process provided by UK to the training of approximately 20,000 Ukrainian soldiers was completed in an incredible 5 weeks. Due to the violent momentum of Operation Interflex, British commanders gave the Ukrainians an accelerated regimen. More than 4,000 British soldiers from the Irish and Welsh Guards, Royal Marines, Mercians, Rangers, Rifles, and Royal Anglian regiments participated in the training regimen run by the 11th Security Assistance Brigade. Training areas including Salisbury Plain, Hankley, Common Longmoor, Catterick and Otterburn have been fully commandeered for this critical military mission. The UK was also the first ally to train Ukrainian pilots in NATO airspace tactics. But Prime Minister Rishi Sunak remained ambivalent about providing fast jets to the Ukrainian military. Over 35 days, Ukrainian soldiers were taught a range of combat skills such as counter-it, rural and urban warfare. In addition, this military training covered important topics such as medical trauma, gun-bearing marksmanship, armed conflict law, and surviving in a hostile environment, especially on Salisbury Plain. Ukrainian soldiers were shown to lead artillery and coordinate airstrikes using S-90 self-propelled artillery donated by Britain. Since the 155mm squared mobile artillery system is capable of firing up to 6 rounds per minute, it was very important for Ukrainian soldiers to receive this training. In addition, the large area in Wiltshire was also used for armored infantry training, live shooting with general-purpose machine guns and specialist sniper training. The United Kingdom donated thousands of machine guns, sniper rifles, and ammunition in Longmoor, Hampshire. Ukrainian soldiers are guided on routine patrols. Hankley Common in Surrey is no longer allowed to host low-flying Chinook helicopters. In addition to these trainings given by the UK in different regions, Ukrainian soldiers were also provided with one-on-one helicopter pilot training using drones at night and participating in close combat in simulated villages. A final week's exercise to test the training of Ukrainian soldiers was held in Salisbury. A top military source has confirmed that Ukrainian training has now become the main priority of the Ministry of Defense because trainers were brought in from Canada, Denmark, Finland, Lithuania, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Australia, and New Zealand to assist the British trainers. Ukrainian soldiers training in the UK received everything they needed during this time period, equipped with a full range of equipment, weapons, ammunition, and 24-hour training programs. Apart from the professionals involved in this military training, the group also included accountants, lawyers, businessmen, and even taxi drivers. While most were young, some were in their 40s. But they all had one thing in common. All of the Ukrainian soldiers trained in the United Kingdom were lion-hearted people with a genuine desire to fight for their country. As we mentioned, the brave Ukrainian soldiers, including volunteers, stayed in the UK for 5 weeks for training and then returned to Poland. Those forces are now in a position to take direct action. But this effort, combined with the shortage of donated ammunition, was undermining conventional education. For example, the Catterick garrison lacked grenades for troop training. The NR was virtually non-existent and there was a shortage of live ammunition. However, despite all this, the training process was completed and the deficiencies were mitigated as well as possible. Now the aim of the Ukrainian armed forces is to capture the Crimean Peninsula. Ukraine has finally unveiled its new secret plan to recapture the peninsula. The plan includes the destruction of the huge 19-kilometer bridge between Crimea and Russia, which has been dubbed Europe's longest bridge. Alexei Danilov, Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, published this plan ahead of the counterattack that Kiev is preparing this spring. In this grand scheme, Secretary Danilov proposed that all Ukrainians working for the Moscow-appointed administration on the peninsula be put on trial. In addition, he stated that some will face criminal charges while others will lose their state pensions and be barred from public jobs. Under this plan, Russians who moved to Crimea after 2014 will be deported. Meanwhile, all real estate deals made under Russian rule would be voided. In another part of the plan was particularly badly received by Russia. Secretary Danilov advocated renaming the city of Sebastopol, the port of Crimea, and the home base of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. The Ukrainian parliament stated that the Russian fleets in the Black Sea could be called Object Number 6 before choosing another name. The Moscow-appointed head of Sebastopol, Mikhail Razovlev, has vehemently opposed Danilov's plan. The plan also included the removal of the strategic Kerch Bridge, the longest bridge in Europe at 19 kilometers. In October, a truck bomb significantly damaged the bridge and Russia accused Ukrainian military intelligence. Ukraine did not claim responsibility for the bomb, but Ukrainian authorities have repeatedly threatened to strike the bridge. Now, the Ukrainian forces openly put forward the Crimean plan and dared to state the bridge is now a primary target. On the other hand, before this critical Crimea plan was published, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken stated that Washington did not actively encourage Ukraine to take Crimea back and said that the decision rests with Kiev. He also added that Pentagon officials have recently questioned Ukraine's ability to take Crimea in the near future, given the ongoing clashes in both Donbass and the south of the country. In a virtual panel chaired by Secretary Blinken, many officials argued that Ukraine could not fully restore its territorial integrity. In addition, those present at the panel thought that trying to liberate Crimea was too risky and dangerous, and that it was impossible or very dangerous for Vladimir Putin not to give up the peninsula. Secretary Blinken, however, put an end to this uncertainty by declaring that Ukraine is by no means weak and will be continually supported by the United States of America. While Moscow annexed Crimea in 2014, much of the world refuses to recognize it as a Russian territory. Therefore, Ukraine's plans for Crimea will reflect the wishes of the majority of the world. The transfer of ownership of the peninsula to Kiev, on the other hand, will be a crucial feature of any peace negotiation that could end the ongoing war, with the Kremlin demanding that Ukraine recognize its authority over Crimea as part of the peace terms. In short, we hope that Ukraine will both win this war and succeed in taking back the Crimean Peninsula.